Remember last time that when the people went to see the plays, they knew everything that was going to happen, and they sat up in the high seats looking down on the characters, just the way the gods sat up above human beings looking down on them. They knew everything that was going to happen, just the way the gods know everything that's going to happen. And that, of course, gives a double meaning to everything that the characters say, because the characters don't know. When Oedipus pronounces sentence on the murder of Laius, we know he's pronouncing sentence on himself. He doesn't know. When the play, we've gotten up to the point where Oedipus has finally gotten to Thebes after meeting his father at the crossroads. Is that an accident that he meets his father at the crossroads? No, it's the will of the gods. The will of the gods is going to be carried out no matter what. It's the struggle against it that annoys them so much, and which makes them want to punish people in the first place. Remember that if Jocasta and Laius had accepted the will of the gods, Oedipus would have grown up, heard the prophecy, run away. It never would have come true. If Oedipus had accepted the will of the gods and stayed where he was in, where was he? Anybody remember where King Polybus is king of Thrace? If he'd have stayed in Thrace and accepted the will of the gods, he'd have never met his real mother and father, and it never would have happened. It's only because they try to evade the prophecy that it's doomed to come true. So he meets his father, he kills him, he runs into the Sphinx, he answers the Sphinx's riddle, and they make him king by acclamation. Before Oedipus shows up, Jocasta's queen, who's the man running things until they get a man to run them? Because remember, for the Greeks, you need to have a man, because the king's real job is leading armies and fighting wars. They didn't think too much of women being able to do that. So who's the most important man in Thebes before Oedipus shows up? Creon. Creon, the brother-in-law, Jocasta's brother-in-law, Laius's brother. And when Oedipus shows up, of course, they want to make Oedipus king. And why do they have to marry him to Jocasta? To prevent civil war in the next generation. Remember, if Oedipus becomes king, he has children. He doesn't marry Jocasta. Jocasta marries somebody else. She has children. Those children are going to have Laius's claim to the throne. Oedipus's children will have his claim to the throne. There's going to be civil war. So the easiest way to avoid that is to marry him off to Jocasta. And of course, that's the will of the gods to begin with. It's the whole prophecy that they've been trying to evade. When he marries Jocasta, things go pretty well for a while, as they usually do. They have 4 children, a daughter Antigone, then 2 sons, Polynices and Eteocles, who are twins, and a third daughter is Mene. And when the play opens, things had been going along pretty good. What's wrong now? What's the big problem? When we open, the chorus comes to see the king. What do they want to see him about? What's happening in Thebes that everybody's upset over? Sorry? There's a plague going on. Now, whenever there's a plague or any other disaster, who's behind it? The gods are behind it. You want to find out why the gods are doing this to you, so where do you go?
The oracle.
You go to the oracle, like you go to find out about everything. So when they come, the first thing Oedipus says is, I'm king, it's my job to straighten this stuff out, and I won't rest until I find out what's going on. Now, it's very important that he doesn't go to the oracle himself. Who does he send? He sends Creon. He's got to be good friends with Creon. He likes Creon. Creon is actually a pretty likable guy. He's easygoing, and he's not as intense as Oedipus is, and they get along pretty good. Then he trusts Creon, so he sends Creon to the oracle. And the importance of that is that when Creon comes back with a message, he becomes the messenger of the gods. Whatever you do to Creon, you do to the gods that sent him. And that, of course, enrages the treatment that Creon gets, just enrages the gods all the more. In a classical tragedy, there's the protagonist who represents the will of man, and the antagonist that represents the will of God. And Creon is the antagonist. Once he goes and gets that message, he becomes the messenger of the gods, and he's the one you have to listen to. Does Oedipus listen to him?
No.
No. No matter what he tells him, no matter how good advice it is, Oedipus can't listen. He's got to have his own way. First thing that Creon comes back and tells him is that the gods are mad. The gods have sent the plague. Why? What are they mad about? Nobody bothered to find out who killed Laius. A king's been murdered, and they let it go at that. Now, who does everybody think murdered the king? Thieves, a bunch of bandits, a whole group of people. Because the servant who was there with Laius and ran away can't go back home and admit that he didn't stand up to one man, so he has to make up this story. So everybody thinks it's thieves, but nobody's actually gone and tried to find the thieves and execute them. And the gods are mad about that. And Oedipus says, all right, we'll find them. And when we find the murderer, nobody under pain of death is to give him any kind of help whatsoever. Now, we know, of course, he's just pronounced sentence on himself. He goes about it in a rational way, which everything in classicism stresses. The first thing he's going to do is to try to solve this mystery. So, the first thing any good policeman would do, look for witnesses. So he says, did anybody see this murder? And they say, yes, there was a servant with him. Now, when the servant comes back to Thebes, tells his story, outlaws did it. Everybody says, okay, there was nothing you could do about it. Then Oedipus shows up. When Oedipus shows up, the servant recognizes him as the murderer. But everybody's claiming this guy is a hero. He can't stand up and say he's the one who killed Laius. They'll just kill him. So instead, he goes to Jocasta, and he asks to be transferred out to a farm as far away from Thebes as he can get. But this guy's a slave. Servants are slaves. Slaves don't get to ask for a transfer. Why does this guy think that he can go ask the queen for this favor and be pretty sure he's going to get it?
He was a king's servant.
He was the king's servant. He's the one who put the baby out on the hillside. He's the trusted retainer. They owe him. So Jocasta says, no problem, and has sent him off there where he's been safe until now. Oedipus says, well, where is this guy? I want to interrogate him. He said, well, he's off on his farm. It's going to take a while to get him here. Oedipus says, all right, send for him, bring him. Now, in the meantime, he's the only witness, but Oedipus doesn't rest. Oedipus wants to get this thing solved. And Creon wants to help him solve it. So Creon brings in another oracle. And the oracle he brings in is pretty important. That's Tiresias. Tiresias is blind. But his blindness is what makes him so important. He wasn't always blind. When he was young, he was walking through the woods one day. And he came across a pair of snakes coupling. Instead of leaving them alone, he takes his staff and separates them. Poof! They turn out to be a god and a goddess seeing what it was like to do with his snakes. They're real upset about being interrupted. So they're going to get even with him. So they play the dirtiest trick on him that they can think to play on a man. Anybody know what it is? They turn him into a woman. And for 7 years, he lives as a woman. One day, he's walking along in the woods, and he sees two more snakes coupling. You think by this time he'd learned to leave the animals alone. No, he's got to separate them. God and the goddess again. Poof. They're upset. They play the dirtiest trick on a woman that they can think of. They turn her into a man. So Tiresias is back being a man. Some years later, Zeus and Hera, the king and queen of the gods, are having an argument about who has it better during sex, men or women. Zeus says women have it better, and of course Hera says no, men have it better. So Zeus says, hey, we can settle this. Tiresias has been a woman, and he's been a man. If anybody knows, he knows. We'll bring him up to Mount Olympus and ask him. So they bring Tiresias up, and they say, who has it better? And Tiresias says, women have it way better. Hera is so mad at losing the argument, she strikes him blind. Now, even the king of the gods can't undo the act of another god, so he can't just restore his sight. So to make up for that, Zeus gives Tiresias second sight. He can see into the future. And that means that all of his pronouncements, all of his prophecies, are the will of Zeus. When you insult Tiresias, you insult Zeus. Now, Tiresias doesn't just walk around and every time he sees somebody, their whole future appears in front of him. It comes to him in flashes. So that when Creon says to him, we're going to go to the king and he's going to ask you some questions about this murder and see what you can see, Tiresias doesn't think too much about it. He's famous as a prophet and as a seer, so that's what he does. It doesn't seem like it's too dangerous. But as soon as he's brought into Oedipus's presence, he realizes that the prophecy from the past has been fulfilled. That this is the murder of Laius that he's talking to, the king, and that he's married to his own mother. Why doesn't he just tell Oedipus that right off the bat? Will Oedipus be glad to hear it? No, Tiresias knows he could get himself killed here if he tells the truth. So the first thing he says is, I don't want to talk about this. Oedipus says, I'm investigating a murder here. Who cares what you want? Tell me what you see. Tiresias says, you don't want to know. Oedipus says, I do want to know. Tell me what it is. He says, well, I don't want to tell you about this. You don't want to know, I don't want to tell you. And Oedipus says, well, that's because you don't know. You can't make a prophecy. You're just a blind old man. Tiresias loses his temper. I'm blind? I'm blind? You don't know who you're living with. And you don't know what you've done. Don't tell me I'm blind. Oedipus says, what are you talking about? And because Tiresias is angry, you notice emotions always get in the way. If Tiresias had kept his cool and let his intellect in the way, he would have lied his way out of it and the whole play would have turned out different. He says, you're living with your mother, you've married your mother, and you've killed your father. Oedipus is outraged because he's certain that's a lie. Why is he certain that's a lie? Who does Oedipus think his mother and father are? Polybus and Merope from Thrace. So I haven't married Merope and I haven't killed Polybus. This guy must have heard, remember, Oedipus has heard this prophecy before when he was a young man. That's why he ran away from Thrace. So he says, somebody must have heard about this prophecy. Somebody knows who I am. And they're using it to discredit me. Now, who stands to gain from turning me into a monster in everybody's sight because I married my mother and I'm a murderer? And who would gain by discrediting my children? Because who's going to want them to be king, since they're the product of incest? Nobody will even want to look at them. They'll be freaks. Who stands to gain from this? Jocastus' brother-in-law, Creon. And he accuses Creon of putting Tiresias up to telling this lie so that Creon can grab the throne. Because if Oedipus gets thrown out and his children don't get to take over because of the taint of their blood, Creon becomes king. Creon says, I don't want to be king. I never wanted to be king. I like being the king's best friend. Everybody treats you nice. Everybody gives you presents. Everybody wants me to talk to you on their behalf. And whether I do or not, when you make a decision, if it's favorable to them, they give me more presents. And if it's not favorable to them, they don't get mad at me, they get mad at you. Why would I want to be king and have to take all the responsibility for that when I have all the good parts of being king as it is? I don't want to be king. Oedipus, though, can't imagine anybody who doesn't want to be king. So he's sure Creon is lying, and he banishes him. Now, banishment for the Greeks was a worse punishment than death, because the most important thing was your love for your city-state, to be a citizen. And having that taken away from you is a kind of a living death. So he gives Creon the worst possible punishment. Of course, Jocastus come out by that time, and your husband and your brother are fighting. Your brother-in-law are fighting. So what do? You step in and make peace. And she gets Oedipus to take back the banishment. But Oedipus says, get out of my sight. I don't want to see you again. Then you notice he's treating Creon badly. He's treating Tiresias badly. They're both the messengers of the gods, so he's insulting the gods. And they're going to get him for that. They've in fact already gotten him. He just doesn't know it yet. When they're gone, he goes in with Jocasta. And he says, I know it can't be me, but I did kill a guy at a crossroads. Jocasta says, it couldn't have been Laius because who killed Laius? Who do they think so? Thieves killed him. It was a whole bunch of guys. It wasn't one man. It couldn't have been you. So she said, yeah, but that prophecy still bothers me. I've got to get to the bottom of this. So a little while goes by, and Oedipus is going to go and interview the witness. He's starting to show up. And of course, just as he shows up, a messenger comes from Thrace to tell Oedipus that King Polybus is dead. And Oedipus probably loved his father, but he's relieved that he's dead and he hasn't killed him. Prophecy came true. In fact, let me back up a second. When Oedipus says to Jocasta, there's this prophecy that I'm going to kill my father and marry my mother, Jocasta says, don't worry about that. They made the same prophecy about us. It never came true. We outsmarted the gods. We made sure it didn't happen. Why doesn't she think, wait a minute, same prophecy, here's a guy, I'm married to him, maybe it came true? How come she doesn't put that together? What does she think happened to her baby? She thinks it's dead. So the prophecy can't have come true. So she's laughing about having outsmarted the gods. That, of course, just makes them angry. Putting your will above the gods and then exulting over it, that's arrogant in the extreme. So when Oedipus goes out to interview the witness, the messenger comes from, it's not Thrace. It's Corinth. Corinth is where, everything I said about Thrace, where Polybus and Mariapia are from, it's really not Thrace, it's Corinth. Anyway, the messenger comes from Corinth and he says Polybus is dead. And Oedipus exults in having evaded the prophecy. I ran away, I didn't kill him, I didn't marry my mother, I triumphed over the gods. And what does the messenger tell him? What are you so happy about? Polybus was no more to you than I am. And Oedipus says, what do you mean? So he wasn't your father. I gave you to him. What do you mean you gave me? Well, a guy gave you to me. He was supposed to put you on the hillside, and he gave you to me instead, and I took you back and gave you to King Polybus. As soon as Jocasta hears this, what does she figure out? This is Oedipus. Oh no, the prophecy did come true. And she says to Oedipus, don't ask any more questions. Trust me, you don't want to know the answer to this. Oedipus says, I'm king. I have a duty here. I have to get rid of this plague. I have to find out who killed Laius. I have to answer the question. Jocasta says, then I can't do anything more for you. And she leaves. What does she do when she leaves? She hangs herself. She kills herself. Inside. Notice, remember, in the Greek drama, all the violence occurs off stage. Why? Because the play is about the intellect. If you go around hanging people or stabbing people's eyes out on stage, it stirs up people's emotions. If their emotions get stirred up, their intellect goes down, and they can't follow what it is you're trying to tell them. What you're trying to tell them, of course, is keep your intellect in control. Don't let your emotions get the upper hand. So you don't want to stir them up. So the violence is always off stage. Oedipus says, who gave me to you as a baby? And right at that moment, of course, the servant shows up. By accident? No, because the gods choreographed it that way. And the messenger says, that guy. Oedipus says to the servant, where did you get that baby from that you gave to this guy when you were supposed to put it on the hillside? Oh, I got that from the king and the queen. Now even Oedipus realizes it was him. He realizes, oh my God, I did kill my father, I did marry my mother. And he's just totally devastated by that. Now he's got to go in and tell his mother, who he thinks doesn't know all this already. Like women don't figure out things faster. When he goes in, what does he find? His dead mother. And he can't stand the sight of her hanging there. So he takes the pins out of her dress. And of course, what happens when he takes the pins out of her dress? Her dress falls off. And there's the naked body of his wife that he's had 4 children with that still turns him on, but it's his mother. Ooh. Stabs out his eyes because he can't stand that. He doesn't even want to think about that sight. Of course, it's in his head now. He'll never get it out. Stabs out his eyes, goes back out and says, somebody lead me to the cliff so I can jump off. But nobody can lead him to the cliff. Why not? I'm sorry? They can't help him. He already made the law that said nobody can help him under penalty of death. Now, the only one who could suspend that law is Creon. And he says to Creon, lead me to the cliff. And Creon says, I don't think so. If the gods wanted you dead, you'd have hanged yourself as well. But you didn't. You blinded yourself instead. So the gods obviously have something more in store for you. And I'm not, I've watched you. I've seen what happens when you go against the will of the gods. I'm not getting myself in that trouble. You're just going to have to live it out. And the end of the play that we have isn't really the best translation. You notice that it's the chorus who delivers the final interpretation of what went on. And it says, count no man lucky who is not dead. Because no matter how good things seem to be going for you, no matter how important you seem to be, you're still at the whim of the gods, of the will of the gods. So no matter how good things are going for you, they're not going to keep going that well forever. The gods are going to destroy you, and especially if you put your will above them. So the whole, not exactly moral, but the whole point of the play is to teach the audience to accept the will of the gods. Oedipus doesn't. That's why there's more than one play. At the end of the play, Oedipus has rejected his responsibility. He says, the gods have done this to me. When in fact, he's done it to himself by not accepting the will of the gods. So there has to be a second play, and then a third, because they did these things in threes, and then they wrote a comedy, so that after 3 tragedies, people are feeling pretty suicidal. So to keep them all cutting their throats, they usually gave them a comedy to send them home with. The second of the plays is Oedipus and Colonus. And that one picks up where the first one leaves off, although it's several years later. Oedipus has been wandering around the country, accompanied by his daughter Antigone and his daughter Ismene. Now remember, there's a law that says you can't help Oedipus. But Antigone says the law of family is the law of the gods. The law of the gods always supersedes the laws of man. So I'm going to go help my father. And Creon doesn't impose the penalty on her, even though it's kind of presumptuous for a woman to go around interpreting what the will of the gods is. During his travels, Oedipus has been tormented by the Eumenides, the Furies. Remember, they were those special demigods, half woman and half eagle, whose sole job it is to torment people who kill blood relatives. And they follow him around, and they swoop down and claw him, and they foul his food whenever he gets hold of any, and they just torment and torture him all the time. Finally, he comes to the outskirts of Athens, which is what called Colonus. And when he gets there, there's a grove sacred to the Eumenides, kind of like an outdoor temple. And there's been a prophecy that everything will be all right if he can find that place and be buried there. So he goes into the grove. Now the guy who's in charge of the grove says to him, "What are you doing here? You're not allowed in here." And Oedipus says, "I'm not leaving. This is where I'm destined to be." So they go to the king, and the king is Theseus, and Theseus is a great hero. And so he comes out and says to this old man, what are you doing here? And Oedipus says to him, "I'm Oedipus, And he tells him his story. And Theseus says, oh, you're Oedipus. I don't think we want you around here. You are the bad luck guy of all time. And bad luck tends to splash over. But I'm not, obviously the gods are really involved in your life. So I better be careful here and not just drive you away. Because remember, you're supposed to give hospitality. Sending him away without hospitality would be breaking the rules of the gods. So what does Theseus do with this puzzle? How does he solve it? How do they always solve stuff when they want to know about the gods? They go to the oracle. And the oracle says that wherever Oedipus is buried, on that spot, the city will win a great victory. And it's freedom. And so Theseus says, oh, this guy's good luck after all. So he says to him, you can stay. Now in the meantime, back in Thebes, the boys have grown up. And despite their tainted bloodline, they've been made king. They're twins, and they didn't know how to decide between them, so they made both of them king. So you got two brothers running things. How well does that work? Yeah, not too well. They're fighting all the time. And everybody's afraid one of these little brotherly battles is going to turn into a real fight, and there's going to be civil war. So the only way to stop that is to get rid of one of them or the other. And they pick Eteocles, even though he's a minute younger. And so it really should be Polynices. But they like Eteocles better. So they make him king, and Polynices has to be banished. Remember, that's the worst thing that can happen to you. But he has to be banished because if he stays, a lot of followers are going to gather around him. Everybody that Eteocles annoys is going to go over onto Polynices' side, and you're going to have civil war sooner or later. So they send him away. But he doesn't go away willingly, and he doesn't go away happily, and he doesn't accept that decree. Instead, he goes around and raises an army. 7 great captains, one for each of the gates of Thebes. And he's going to come back and attack them. But he hears about the prophecy that wherever his father dies and gets buried, that's going to be a lucky city. Of course, everybody's heard about the prophecy by now. And Creon, who's acting as friend of the king, Creon's been perfectly, done everything he ought to do. He's been a good regent. Normally, remember when Oedipus left, the boys are too young to be king. So who ran the place? Creon did. And he ran it virtuously. Most other people given the regency over a young king would have arranged an accident for him, would have poisoned him, would have killed him in some way. Creon doesn't. Creon teaches them statecraft, raises them to be kings, and when they come of age, he steps aside with no problem at all. He does the right thing. He follows the will of the gods. He's decorous. He follows decorum. He does what he's supposed to do. So he's still acting as sort of the Secretary of State or whatever. And he comes to Athens. And he says to Oedipus, we want you to come home. All is forgiven. Oedipus says, you heard about the prophecy apparently. You just want me to come home and die. Where were you for the last 9 years or whatever it's been? Well, I've been wandering around being tortured. You didn't offer to let me come home then. No, I'm not coming home. But Creon knows this guy is valuable. So he grabs Antigone and kidnaps her. And he's going to grab Oedipus as well. I love my daughter, but you can take her. I'm staying here. This is where I'm supposed to be. So Creon tries to grab him too, and just when he does, Theseus shows up with an even larger force and takes them both back. Creon has to go home without Oedipus. Right after that, Antigone comes to her father and says, there's somebody who wants to see you. A stranger. Oedipus says, I don't give interviews. Tell him to go away. Antigone says, you'll want to talk to this one. Why? Because it's your son Polynices. Oedipus says, yeah, I would have liked to talk to him 9 years ago. He hasn't even sent me a postcard in the meantime. I don't want to see him. Antigone says, but he's your son. You have to see him. All right, so they bring Polynices in, and Polynices says to his father, look, they threw me out. I'm going back with my army. But if you come with me, there won't be a war. They'll see that I brought good fortune back to the city. They'll take the crown away from my brother. They'll give it to me, who deserves it. I'm your real heir. I was born a minute earlier. And there won't be a battle. Oedipus says, I don't care. There better not be a battle anyway, because if there's a battle, you are going to die. And I'm not coming back with you. So Polynices goes to go away, and Antigone says to him, well, you can't seriously... Look, he's like Tiresias now. Since he went blind, he can see the future. If he says you're going to die in this battle, you will die. And Polynices says, well, I have to do this. So she says, well, if you won't save yourself, think about all those men who are going to serve under you. They'll all be killed. And Polynices says, well, sometimes a good general has to lie to his troops. So I won't tell them about that. He goes back and raises his army. War is impending. Theseus comes to Oedipus and says, I'm going to let you, I'm going to let you stay, and I'd like to hear your story. I'd like to hear your side of it. And I remember at the end of the first play, Oedipus is blaming the gods for doing this terrible thing to him. But now, Oedipus says, this was all my own fault. I disobeyed the will of the gods. All of the suffering that I've had, I deserve. I brought it on my own head. It was my fault. If the gods want to go on torturing me, I don't want to be tortured, but I can see the justice in it. I never should have gone against the will of the gods. I wish I had. I'm sorry that I did. As soon as he says that, the sky opens up. Zeus welcomes him up to Olympus, and the play ends with Oedipus having accepted the responsibility for his actions and having given the message a second time to the audience, don't disobey the will of the gods. Even I can see what that brings, and it is my fault. Accept the will of the gods. I didn't see what happened to me. And once he accepts that and accepts the prophecy, then he goes on up to Mount Olympus. So the second play ends with Oedipus having accepted his responsibility. There's a third play, because even when people know the right thing, they don't always act in terms of it. And the third play is called Antigone. Unusual because it's a play about a woman. The woman is really the central character. Although Antigone is an unusual woman. She's extremely strong at a time when women were not encouraged to be particularly strong. And she's very bright at a time when women were not thought to be all that smart. The play opens after the battle for Thebes. Polynices and Eteocles have met on the battlefield and killed one another. Who becomes king? Who's left of the people we know? Creon. Creon is now the king. Creon hates Polynices for this reason. During the battle, and the war goes on for a while, and it's basically a draw. But Eteocles really has more resources, and Polynices can see that sooner or later the battle's going to turn against him. That's why he wants the one-to-one combat with his brother, in which they both get killed. However, somebody goes to an oracle to find out what they ought to do in Thebes. And the oracle says that if Creon's son goes into battle and is killed, they'll win. What should Creon do? He should sacrifice his son. He should let his son go out and get killed. But he doesn't. He puts his will above the will of the gods. He even puts his personal benefit above Thebes, which as king he should never do. He comes to his son and says, look, the oracle says you're going to get killed if you go to battle. I don't want that to happen. I got some friends in a faraway country. They'll take care of you. I want you to go there and sit out the war. His son says, oh, all right, but I need some money. So Creon goes off to get him some money. When Creon's gone, his son says, I have an opportunity to die for my country, to save my country. My life can save Thebes. And my father wants to take that away from me? make me a coward instead of a hero? I'm not going to let that happen. So he straps on his armor and runs out and almost immediately gets killed. And of course, because he gets killed, they win the battle. But Creon has lost one of his sons. And he hates Polynices for that. If Polynices hadn't raised that army and hadn't come back and hadn't put his will above the will of Thebes, let alone the will of the gods, his son wouldn't have been killed. So he hates Polynices so much, he says, nobody is allowed to bury him. Leave his body out there for the dogs and the buzzards. Now, you remember one of the obligations that you have is to bury the dead. So he's defying the will of the gods. Before Polynices left, when he had come to visit Oedipus and Antigone tried to talk him out of it, the last thing he said to her was, look, I want you to promise me that if this prophecy comes true and I die, that you'll see I get a decent funeral. She says, oh, no problem. So she's promised to bury her brother. But Creon has made a law that says if anybody buries Polynices, they die. So Antigone sneaks out during the night, and the guard falls asleep, and she throws some dirt over Polynices. It's not a real burial, but it's a symbolic one, and it's good enough. Guard comes in the morning, goes to Creon, and says, they buried him. What do you mean they buried him? Oh, I fell asleep, I think. And there's dirt on him, so he's as good as buried. Creon is outraged. And he has to be as king. Remember, he's a new king. Whenever somebody starts being king, their reign is pretty shaky. There are obviously people who may not want him to be king. He always has to worry about demonstrating that he's in charge, that he's going to be the king. Well, if the first law that you make, somebody breaks, and you let them get away with it, what does that show about your ability to be king? Yeah, that you're not strong enough to do it. So he has to find out who this is, and he says to the guard, find out who buried him, or I'm going to bury you. And when Antigone hears of that, she can't let an innocent guy die for what she did, so she shows up and says, I buried him. And she confesses that publicly. That really puts Creon on the spot. So he tries to give her an out. He says, maybe you didn't hear about the law. She said, no, I heard about the law. That was man's law. It isn't as important as the law of the gods. The law of the gods says you have to bury bodies. You have to bury people. You can't leave them out there like that. And the law of the will, remember, she just made that same argument with helping Oedipus. The law of family is more important than the law of the state. It's the law of the gods. I'm following the gods. You're going against the gods. Now here's a woman telling off not only a man in public, but a king in public. How does Creon take that? He's outraged by it. And he sentences her to death. And he justifies himself. He says, there can't be one law for the friends and relatives of Creon and another law for the citizens of Thebes. There can only be one law, just like there can only be one king. And you broke the law. You knowingly broke the law, and you knew what the penalty was. I have no choice but to kill you. But she's a relative. Remember, you can't go around killing relatives. So instead, he can't put her out on a mountainside, because obviously she'll walk away, or somebody will come and take care of her. So he puts her in a stone house to starve to death. Now, when Antigone came back, a love affair developed between her and Haman, Creon's son. Creon doesn't like Antigone. She's an outspoken woman, and he doesn't like that. But he encourages the match, because if Antigone marries and has children, her children have the blood of Oedipus in them. They have a claim to the throne. But Creon's king now. His children and his grandchildren will have a claim to the throne. So what's going to happen in the second or third generation? Civil war again. So what's the easy way around that? Same way as it was with Oedipus and Jocasta. You marry the two. Antigone marries Haman. They have both bloodlines. Nobody can have as good a claim as that. No civil war. So he's encouraging the match. And Haman is in love with Antigone. He finds out his father sentenced his girlfriend to death, And he's outraged, and he comes and confronts his father. And his father says, I had no choice. I'm the king. The king can't look weak. I certainly can't look weak when I'm confronted by a woman. So I had to put her to death. Haman says, you're no father of mine. And storms away. And as he's going, Creon says, don't do anything foolish. I've already made a decree. Anybody who helps her or tries to help her escape will be put to death. Don't make me do that. Haman storms away. And he goes, of course, to go and free Antigone. However, in the meantime, faced with the long, slow death of starvation, Antigone decides to take the intelligent way out and to poison herself, which she does. Haman shows up to rescue her. He's already too late. What does he do? Kills himself. He stabs himself. Messenger goes back home and tells Creon's wife that her son's just killed himself. Her last son. She hasn't got any more left. Lost one in a war. This one's killed himself. What does she do? Kills herself. In the meantime, Creon's pondering what he ought to do. And the chorus, who always makes sense of things, says to him, can't you see that you're wrong? You watched Oedipus. You saw Oedipus defy the will of the gods, and you saw what happened to him. You were an instrument in that. You've always behaved in the right fashion until now. And now you've done the same thing as Oedipus. You defied the will of the gods by not burying him, and worse yet, you've sent somebody who defended the gods to their death. When Antigone starts to tell him this is what the gods think, she's a messenger of the gods. She's telling him the truth. Creon finally realizes, you know, you're right. I disobeyed the will of the gods. Something terrible is going to happen to me. What can I do? And the chorus says, first, go get Antigone, because we got a real bad feeling about this. And as soon as you get her, go and bury Polynices with your own hands and make sacrifice to the gods and try to apologize. Maybe it isn't too late. And Creon says, yes, you're right. And he goes off to free Antigone. Of course, when he gets there, he finds Antigone dead. He finds his son dead. A messenger comes back and says, oh yeah, by the way, your wife just committed suicide too. Creon's in the same position that Oedipus was at the end of the first play, with this one difference. Creon accepts responsibility. Creon says, man's fate rises behind him, dark as a wave. I tried to escape that fate and brought all this on myself. This is my doing. If I had listened to the will of the gods, none of this would have happened. What's happened to me is as terrible as things can get, but I deserve it. So when we get to the third play, you get that second lesson, which is, even when you've been shown the truth, you may, like Creon, foolishly ignore it. And if you do, you're going to be destroyed. Anybody have any questions on the trilogy? Okay, let me change tapes then, and we're going to go on to neoclassical.